Here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. First of all, how many people get your name wrong when they try to pronounce it?
Well, so many people I don't even care anymore. I just however it comes out. Because I live in, it's a funny name where I come from.
Right.
From England. Growing up, it's a funny name. But in Mexico, it's even stranger name. So I just normally make it Ian. And my second name, Grillo, which in Spanish is Grillo.
Right.
So everyone...
They mess that up too if they see it spelled.
Yeah.
Pull this microphone about a fist from your face right there.
Yeah.
There we go. Ioan. I don't think I've ever heard that name before.
There's an actor called Ioan Grillo.
Was he in?
He's in Fantastic Four.
Oh, really?
He's the stretchy guy.
Oh, no shit.
In Fantastic Four. So yeah, he's made that name a little bit more.
A little bit more acceptable? How did you wind up living in Mexico City?
So I came to Mexico, or went to Mexico in the year 2000. And I kind of messed around for a few years in the UK. Wanted to get into journalism. So I found one way to get into it was to start working in a foreign country. Rather than going to my local newspaper and work and go to a foreign country and start working. And I had a romantic idea about Latin America, thinking I'd be like, I saw the movie Salvador, Oliver Stone's movie from the 80s. I kind of had a romantic idea about running around with guerrillas, fighting military dictatorships. So I arrived in Mexico in 2000 and got a job at an English language newspaper.
How old were you?
27 when I first left the UK, yeah. 28 when I messed around for a bit in Mexico as well, and then got the job when I was 28.
Mexico City's a wild place.
Yeah.
It's so packed. It's hard to... I've only been there twice for UFC events.
Yeah.
But every time I'm there, I'm just shaking my head like, I can't believe how this traffic works. It's crazy.
Yeah, 18 years, and I've spent a lot of time in that traffic.
Nobody cares about red lights, green lights. They don't care.
It's stressful. Everyone wants to cut you up all the time.
Yeah.
People shout at you a lot. You have to get used to people calling you like pendejo, cerdo. I tried different tactics. Now I just try and relax and not get angry.
Did you know how to speak Spanish before you went there?
Yeah. So I spent 1 year in Spain, living in Spain before I went there. I spent a year in the Middle East as well. But yeah, I started off when I arrived, I spoke more to Spanish, which is like, oye, tío, coño, tío. And then I changed more to like the Mexican Spanish, which was like, oye, güey, ¿qué pasó, güey?
Right. Yeah. So when did you start getting into narco journalism?
So, like I arrived, say, with a romantic idea about what I might cover in Mexico or Latin America. And right away I realized all that idea of guerrillas and military dictatorships that had gone. That was the last century. Che Guevara, all that stuff had gone. But right away when I arrived, when I very first arrived, back in the UK, I grew up around a lot of drugs in the UK. So going back to the 80s, I grew up with a lot of people taking drugs. I had a few friends who died from heroin overdoses back then. 4 people I knew died of heroin overdoses. I had a sister who became schizophrenic, smoking a lot of. Well, no, became schizophrenic, and there'd be a lot of drugs being smoked around that time as well.
Was it pot?
Yeah, back then it was Moroccan hashish.
There is a connection. And we've been exploring that a lot lately. We went into this marijuana debate between Alex Berenstein and Dr. Mike Hart from Canada, and we talked about it. And I know people that have had that happen to them, where they've had schizophrenic or psychotic breaks because of just massive doses of marijuana, and especially people that don't do it, or people that do it too much for too long. It does happen.
I heard that debate. That's one of the reasons why it came to mind. I don't know. A lot of people smoke weed, smoke hash.
A lot of people, it's fine.
Now, when my sister had a breakdown when she was 18 and I was 16 at the time, and when that came out, it turned out also my grandmother had an issue with schizophrenia.
Right.
And I don't know if it was a time bomb waiting to go off, or if it was how much the hash was involved in that. There's other issues as well. So I don't really know the science of it. But anyway, going back, so I've been around a lot of drugs before. So when I arrived in Mexico, actually, one of the first arriving in Mexico, I ended up hanging around with some people, and they were smoking a lot of crack in Mexico. It's some of the first people I met.
Wow.
I went down to the beach, like backpacking down to the beach, and these people were smoking crack, and I was like, this is kind of strange. I didn't know there's people smoking crack down here. So when I got a job at the local newspaper in English. And I just started looking at the crime thing. One of the first stories I did was on the issue of crack being sold locally and how that linked to cartels. And then very soon, just very, very quickly, I just fell in right away. Like I said, all these things happen by accident. I just fell into covering the crime beat. And this is going back to 2001. So 2001, that was the same year that Chapo Guzman escaped from prison. Then I was calling a lot then to a great journalist from Tijuana, Jesus Blanconelas, a real legend from Tijuana, who survived the shooting by cartels. And, phoning him up all the time, just getting him, to give me information, give me tips. And that was how it really started. Another big story I did back in those days was the court-martial of some generals for drug trafficking. And that was really where it began back then.
Generals for drug trafficking. How much of an issue is that? Corruption must be unbelievably rampant.
So, corruption even isn't a strong enough word for it. Sometimes I call it state capture. So this is the real beginning, and this has been a whole crazy 18 years of covering this stuff. This was just the very beginning back then. I've seen a whole lot of very crazy stuff in that time. But just to get a sense of how bad the corruption is, or what it really means on the ground level there. There's policemen. You interview policemen, you get to know the policemen in a certain town, certain city. And it's hard to know, or military guys or politicians, and you want to believe these are good people. You want to believe there's good policemen out there who really want to stop crime. So there was one policeman. His nickname was Tyson, like Mike Tyson. His nickname was Tyson because he was a well-built bloke, well-built guy. And he was friendly with the press. A guy from Michoacan, friendly with the press. And then it came out that he was actually a drug cartel member, a ranking member in the drug cartel. And he actually confessed. They used to have a thing where the police, the federal police, when they got him to confess on camera. And he confessed not only was he turning a blind eye, not only was he carrying out murders, he was training the young kids how to decapitate people, how to cut people up. And he was explaining in graphic detail how he'd how they managed to cut limbs off, how he gets young people to train them to cut limbs off, to get them to lose their fear. So that's the level of corruption. That could be a policeman you're dealing with, and that's really who they are. So that's one of the crazy things about the corruption down there.
Did you have any hesitancy in getting involved in narco journalism knowing this? I would imagine that's one of the most dangerous avenues to pursue in journalism.
So this was little by little I got involved in covering this. So going back to 2000, this hadn't happened. This war hadn't happened. It was still like a crime issue at that moment. So I began to cover these things, and then around 2004, I got a job for the Houston Chronicle out of Houston, Texas. I was a stringer covering Mexico for them. And I flew up to Nuevo Laredo, and there was a turf war beginning there, which is really the beginning of the drug war, which has torn Mexico apart. Began on the border with Texas in this city called Nuevo Laredo, over the bridge from Laredo, Texas, back in 2004. So there was a lot of interest from the Texas newspapers, what was going on. There's a whole bunch of bodies piling up there. But again, this going back to these days, and this is kind of innocent looking at myself then, and innocent looking at what Mexico was like then. They would simply say, go to the place, I'd drive up to Monterrey, rent a car, and just drive the car to Nuevo Laredo just by myself. And now people just don't do that. There's just too much crazy stuff going on. But back then it was still like, you can just do that. So there was
When you say crazy stuff, like what kind of crazy stuff?
Now you can get stopped by an armed group driving on those roads. You could just drive along, and there could be a group of guys with guns could stop the car, get someone out, take you away. There's a whole... People are a lot more careful about where you now when you move around the roads, you got to be very careful how you move and how you plan this stuff. You don't just wander by yourself, drive around these places. So back then when this was happening, and there was these bodies turning up, and I was trying to figure out why. And there was one guy interviewed who was the head of Chamber of Commerce, and I talked to him. A very interesting guy. About a couple of weeks later, he became the chief of police for the city. And they asked him, they said, are you scared? You scared about being killed? And he said, no, I'm not scared. It's only the corrupt people who get killed. And he was shot dead 6 hours after he gave that statement. They shot him dead. And that was one of the real markers of something really strange is going on in Mexico. Something is like going to erupt in Mexico. And then from there, it kind of just escalated and escalated. And I started working for other media, Time Magazine, New York Times, different people. And after a while, I said, I can't do this. I can't just write news stories about this. I've got to write books about this because this stuff is big and it's complicated.
It must be immensely complicated. For the people that live there, it seems like there's no escape. I mean, if you can't turn to the police are the cartel. There's the cartel, the police, all of the politicians, most likely, if they're alive, have to be compromised.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some very, very desperate people, and I mean, there's been some inspirational people as well fighting this. There's been heroes. There are heroes. Just to get more of a sense of what that means on the ground as well, and some of the things you see. Some of the things that stay with me. For a while it was quite romantic covering this. It was like, wow, I'm going to these places where Chapo Guzman is from. I go up to the village and meet his mother and meet his family. I'm writing about these crazy people. But then you start seeing the human pain in all of this. One of many stories that stick with me was a mother in Monterrey, a school teacher. When you have armed guys moving around, they're also really affecting the civil population, attacking the civil population. And one mother, she was in her home with her 2 children in Monterrey. And it was like in the night just chilling in their house. And then the door broke down. And about 15 guys in bulletproof jackets all came in, long arms, just taking stuff from the house. Held the family, pinned them down. And they said to the mother, which of your children is the oldest? And she was like, didn't know how to reply. I mean, which of your children are the oldest? How do I reply to that? She just couldn't speak. And the eldest son, she had 2 sons, one 18, one 15. The 18-year-old was a philosophy student. And he said, I'm the oldest. I said, okay, you're coming with us. And took him away. And the next day she got a phone call saying, okay, we got your son, give us this amount of money, we'll give him back. So she went round to relatives, just got the money. She wanted to get the money right away. She turned up with the money, gave some money, and then they just cut off the calls. She hadn't heard from him since. And I mean, seeing her face, the devastation, the pain, she said, just couldn't go on with life after that, and just not knowing, not having the closure. And I met her when I went to report on one of the worst atrocities, which was 49 bodies who had all been decapitated, all had their hands and feet cut off, and all been dumped on a road. And they were taken to the morgue in Monterrey, and I arrived at the morgue. I was inside the morgue just smelling the smell of the dead bodies, this kind of weird smell you get from decaying flesh, kind of like a sweet smell you get from when you're around those places where you can smell the bodies decaying. And I was inside the morgue and I came out and she was outside the morgue. And she was trying to see if her son might be among those people, among those bodies.
Wow. It's so insane that this is right next door to America and there's so little effort put on doing something about it, including doing something to mitigate the influence of illegal drugs by making drugs legal. I mean, that would be one gigantic step. You're not going to stop people from doing drugs. I mean, this is an illogical, ridiculous approach. I don't think people should do most of those drugs. But when you make drugs illegal, only criminals are going to sell those drugs. And this is exactly what you have right next door to America. I mean, it's just unbelievably insane that there's this amount of crime a drive away from San Antonio.
Yeah, and talking about that issue of the money and the economics of this.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you look at cocaine. There was 4 main drugs. Now you've got fentanyl coming in as well, and the cartels are making fentanyl.
They're making it.
Making it, yeah. They're making it, bringing in precursors, making it. There was one lab. I was in Nogales about a year and a half ago. They busted a lab in Nogales, right on the border. They had the lab there making the fentanyl and bringing it up here. But as well as that, you've got the other 4 main drugs historically: marijuana, heroin, cocaine, and crystal meth. And this goes back 100 years. So Sinaloa, which is the cradle of Mexican drug trafficking. Sinaloa is a bit like Sicily is to the mafia, like Sinaloa is to the Mexican drug cartels, where it began. And it began so you go back to 1914, you had in the US the Harrison's Narcotics Tax Act, when they they restricted opium and cocaine in the United States. And from 1915, they began a cross-border trade from Mexico into the United States.
So that's when it started.
All the way back then, so over 100 years ago. Some of the very first people doing it were actually Chinese Mexicans. They were Chinese immigrants who arrived in Mexico. They began doing this. They bought opium from China, planted it in Mexico. And some of the first people receiving it were Chinese Americans. Some of these very early cases, there's a case from 1916 investigated. There's documents about this case where there was Chinese Mexicans trafficking to Chinese Americans here in California. And at that time, there was a governor of Baja California involved right back then.
What is the solution? Is there any solutions to this?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people covering this, you get very weary. You want to see solutions.
Yeah.
You want to find solutions, and you want to come with that optimism of finding solutions, and you want to justify why you're doing this, what you're doing this for. Not just to tell the stories, but to look for solutions to this. And it gets weary, but there's three areas I believe that are solutions. First, I do agree with you on the idea of drug policy reform. Again, it's a tough uphill battle. I mean, going back to 2012, I wrote editorials about, one of the reasons you should legalize marijuana is because of the marijuana come from Mexico, which goes to cartels, which pays for killers, which pays for corruption. But at the same time, marijuana, a lot of it is legalized in the United States, and the violence actually just got worse in Mexico. So you've also got the issue of heroin, cocaine, crystal meth, fentanyl, and you've got the cartels who've got into a bunch of other rackets now. They steal crude oil, which is a big deal. They steal billions of dollars worth of crude oil, criminals down there, from pipelines.
Just tap into a pipeline or something?
Yeah, you go to a pipeline. You normally put in two taps. You drill two holes in the pipeline. You drill a hole to take the oil out, and you drill a hole to put water in to try and keep it equal, the pressure the same. If you saw this a crazy video recently of in a small town in Mexico where there was a tap open, a really bad tap. The oil was just spraying out. And a bunch of people were lining up just to pick up the oil from the pipeline, and it exploded, and it was just like crazy death toll.
Yeah, I did see that
from that. But anyway, I do believe in drug policy reform. We have to talk about this. It has to be on the table. I mean, Americans, no one knows really what Americans spend on drugs. But there's this survey which you can find online if you just tap in what do Americans spend on illegal drugs. And there's an estimate of $100 billion a year. So, that amount of money, I mean, that's an estimate. I mean, it could be right. It's hard to know. It's a very round number. But like $100 billion a year. Now, if you think about that pumping into these cartels year after year, I mean, decades, how much of that, if it's 30 billion of that going down to Mexico, then over 10 years, 300 billion, over 30 years, close to $1 trillion, that really creates this monster. But anyway, secondary, so I believe in drug policy reform. I mean, I don't know how, rehab for everyone who needs it, because heroin addicts buy a lot of heroin. So every one you save from that, you can stop a lot of heroin, and a lot of that money, money goes to these people who are doing this stuff. But a second area, I believe, is social work in the neighborhoods. I've done a lot of interviews particularly with the assassins, with the killers. In cartels in Mexico and also around Latin America. I've been traveling around Jamaica, Brazil, Central America, Colombia, talking to a lot of the killers especially. And when I sit down with them, I try and get their life story. Like, how did they first get into this? Because you're not born doing this stuff. And often, in some cases, there's different profiles. There's some of them, there's one guy, this is down in Honduras, which is also a crazy situation. There's a guy there, I'd actually met him before. I'd met him when I was doing some reporting down there back in 2015, and he was driving for us, and he was also carrying a gun to help protect us. I was with a journalist who'd been hit before, who'd been actually shot before. And then I met him again afterwards and got him to tell his story, which is kind of typical of a lot of these guys. And he described how he'd been abandoned as a kid by his parents and had this real hate that he had with the world, like, just fuck the world. And he described the first time that he carried out murders. This was actually, he carried out, later on, he documented all these hits he'd done and decapitations he'd done and this kind of crazy stuff. But the first time he carried out a murder was probably the freakiest, when he was, I think, 14. And they got a family. They went into a house. They got a family and they butchered a family. And when he described that, and then described later on, how he became a hired killer. And the thing about him, like some of these people, you think they're psychopaths. They really don't care. But some of them really do have these conflicts inside their heart. I think he was someone, or listen back to that interview, and he had, and it's hard to balance that, someone who does evil, but also has been a victim as well, a victim and a victimizer. And you feel that pain. Since then, he's himself been murdered. It was one. So how you get social work to reach people from a very young age, because often they're recruited into organized crime when they're 12, 13 years old.
So he butchered this family when he was 14. Was he stealing money from them? Was he?
So the story with that was he said that he was hanging around with these basically street kids, and one of the other kids said, "I know where there's some money in a house. We can get some money in a house." So they went in there and killed this family. And it turned out there was no money there. And the reason the other kid had said go there was because he'd actually been living with his family. And he said they'd been abusive to him. So he wanted to have revenge on his family. But what was so really sick about this, when he was describing it, was they had this family and they would, to stop them defending themselves, they would take them one by one, pin them in a room and take them one by one, take them out, butcher them, how the other ones didn't really know what was going on. And the action itself, but how teenage kids can think about that stuff. And then later on, when he was talking about the decapitations, he was talking about they get contracts with decapitation inside the they say, look, we want this killing, we want you to decapitate the guy. We want this we want to see video of the guy being decapitated. We want that. We want the guy to suffer. And when he hacks their heads off, there'll sometimes still be a moment when the life goes out of them, and when the body is still twitching. He says they can still see there's a bit nerves, almost like a chicken, like a headless chicken. There's a part when they're still twitching a bit, even after they, they've lost their kind of severed their connections there.
Oof. Now, when you're interviewing these people, how nervous are you? This seems like if you're putting all this stuff down, you could implicate them in some crimes, and it seems like it would be very convenient for them to try to get rid of you.
So there's a whole bunch of different situations around interviews. Sometimes I've interviewed people in prisons, a lot of time in prisons. This took me years to get to a lot of these people. First of all, it wasn't when I first started doing this, I was like, how do I reach them? And start going around to drug rehab places and talking to people in drug rehab. Going into prisons. In Ciudad Juarez, I did a lot of interviews. In one prison, I got to know a lot of prisoners in the prison in Ciudad Juarez in a Christian evangelical wing there. And they were going through this weird Christian, Christian discovery of God there. And then on the street, often through contact, all the time through contacts on the street. In Honduras, a lot of great contacts with a friend who's a journalist who grew up in these neighborhoods with all these guys. He just knows loads of these guys from growing up. Now, there's different things. There have been bad situations. I think anybody covering this has had some bad situations. Sometimes people get angry, people threaten them, and so forth. But a lot of the time, when you talk to people, one thing is you have to be very stringent about protecting their identity, and really serious about that, because there's been various cases where other people have interviewed killers and shown their identity, either through them showing their face or through like some dumb thing being shown. And they have been themselves murdered, butchered after they've given these interviews, or like other things have happened, they've been threatened or something, their family, or arrested or so forth. So you really got to protect people's identities. In a way, in terms of when they talk and stuff, and I don't really feel nervous when I interview a lot of these people. I probably feel more nervous here talking to you.
What?
Yeah, that's just probably because it's like on a big show. It's a different thing when you're like talking to. First, you start with easy questions. Like anything, you start talking about how people are human. They're human beings, and people are complicated. And I haven't just interviewed, and I've also got drunk with some of these people and hung around with some of these people for time, trying to get closer. Spent time to try and understand their world a bit more.
What's the most time you've ever spent with these people?
I mean, several days. Yeah. I'll see them again, hang out with them in different places. Not all the time. Sometimes just sit down, do interviews, and just leave. But it's a complicated world. For them, it's their normality. For them, it's normal. It's what they've lived, what they've been through, what's happening around them. I mean, this level of murder that's happening in a lot of parts of Latin America now, it's crazy. But in these areas, and as well, you talk to other people who are just on the edge of this, or have family members involved in this, and it's just, they're living this. I mean, these are levels of violence, and it's interesting to compare historically these levels of violence. Because you look at some of the worst cities like San Pedro Sula, Honduras, Caracas, Ciudad Juarez, and these are places which have levels of violence which are like way worse than medieval Europe. A lot of places in medieval Europe. Oof. I mean, you look at the figures per 100,000, because some of them have over 100 per 100,000, 150 per 100,000. And medieval Europe, a lot of these cities were like 20 per 100,000. So they're way worse now, way worse in the Wild West than like. Now, there are some places in the United States today, like I've done some research recently in Baltimore, Maryland, and it's interesting to compare that to Latin America. And that's a high level, that's 40 per 100,000. So that's not at the same level, but it's significant.
Still more than medieval Europe.
Yeah.
Wow. Baltimore is worse than medieval Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you have to some professors, they might, they might say, well, Jerusalem in this time, or you got to try and it's hard to know, really dig down exactly. I don't know if there was outbreaks of violence and killing in certain places,
right? But the overall average,
yeah,
that's a significant leap, 100% leap.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Baltimore. What about south side of Chicago?
It's not that. I mean, like the level, I think in Chicago comes at around 20 or something, so it's not. Now of the whole city. Now these again, one of the things about the violence in the United States compared to Latin America. I mean, Baltimore is significant, but the city of Baltimore is a fairly small place. What they're talking about. So in Mexico, you have entire states that are like really violent, or entire countries in Latin America. Whereas in the US, it tends to be neighborhoods which are violent. So if you really focus on the south side of Chicago, it's probably similar levels to Baltimore. I think, it's but if you look at the whole city, you've got neighborhoods that are pretty safe in Chicago as well.
Now, through all of this time that you spent down in Mexico, have you seen it? You've seen it escalate? You've seen it get worse and worse?
Yeah. So there was first this really big escalation happened in 2008. It was the first big escalation.
What was the cause of that?
So there was a steady build-up that was happening. And then in 2006, you had the President Felipe Calderón declared a military crackdown on drug cartels. And after that, there was this big response and things started really getting out of hand. We'd already seen violence escalating before. And my kind of theory behind this is that you had in Mexico back in the 20th century more of a top-down centralized government controlling everything. You had the PRI in power, and they were basically controlling it through corruption. So back then they'd have the drug cartels working for them. An interesting story going back then to the late 1970s, a story in a book called Drug Lord by Terence Popper, who interviewed a drug trafficker in the 80s. When he got his job as the Jefe de Plaza, which is the head of a certain territory, when he got the job, he went with the state police at the time and said, I want to become the head of the plaza. And they took him in and tortured him for 2 days and beat the crap out of him, put electric shocks on his nuts, one of the big tortures they do in Mexico, put water laced with chili in his nose. It's not like one of these big, so your whole face burns. These are like torture techniques they have. And after 2 days of torturing him, they said, yeah, well done. You survived well, you've got the job. So, what it shows is that the police had the upper hand. The police controlled this. They were like, okay, we control this racket, and we can fuck around and torture and kill drug traffickers when we like. And all up to the presidency. I mean, there was in that time, Carlos Salinas became president in '94. His brother Raul Salinas, the Swiss, investigated his bank accounts and said he had $500 million in bank accounts, which they believed it was drug money. So right up to the presidency, this was being run. Oof. When Mexico changed democracy, so when I arrived in Mexico, it was changing to democracy. And it was like, wow, great, democracy is going to happen, free market's going to happen. We're in the good days of the 21st century now. But what happened was the political control shifted. So you had a bunch of different political parties, and they were fighting over the drug trade. And, I was one time in Nuevo Laredo when the federal police had a shootout with the municipal police. They were fighting each other, probably because they're working for different drug cartels. Wow. So that's what started. But then you had the techniques, like the technique of beheading wasn't really a big deal. It was very, very rarely used up until around 2006. And one of the first incidents was in Acapulco in 2006, in about June 2006. Now, it might have been inspired by the Al-Qaeda Sakawi, video, which was shown in full on Mexican TV. I remember when that came out, when they decapitated the guy in Iraq. And they decapitated, first it was 2 policemen they decapitated. Later that year, in September 2006, there was 5 heads they rolled onto a disco dance floor. And then this thing just became escalating. It just became this kind of like using this terror, public terror. So 2008 was a big escalation. And then 2011, 12 were like crazy. And then it subsided a bit and the violence got a bit less public. And it was more like hidden, like mass grave stuff. Now, the worst mass grave that's been discovered so far was in Veracruz. Now, I've been to the site of it. And it was 250 bodies were found in this mass grave in one place. And it was right next to a housing estate. And there's families. It was so, one of the saddest things was you could see there kiddies' bicycles and basketball hoops and stuff right next to this. And the field next to that, they dug up 250 bodies. And the smell was like emanating to this housing estate. And it's like a middle class, the dream of becoming middle class, that was the kind of summed in this housing estate, and right next to it, this violence. But when I say a lot of these stories, and I mean, these are crazy stories, but a lot of the weird thing is a lot of Mexico lives a normality around this. This is not what you see every day. This happens. But there's also just a normality that could just be like you're outside here in LA and normal people living normal lives around this as well.
What is the response in Mexico? Like after they wanted to have this military action against the cartels, obviously that hasn't really put a dent in it. What's the current thought process behind dealing with this?
So there was a bunch of like citizen protest movements various times during these recent years, and one of them was a very interesting guy called Javier Cecilia, who's a poet and a writer whose son was murdered. And when it first happened, his son was murdered, and he just came out. Says the press were there. He's like, I can't. This is just Mexico's gone. I can't deal with this. My son's being killed. And then he began talking in and then he went to the streets, and people were coming out publicly, crying. And it was one of the first times there was a realization a lot of innocent people are dying with this. And people come out I went to some of these things, people come out crying, family members, and actually a sense we're victims here, because for a long time a sense it's simply bad guys killing bad guys. and that wasn't the case. Now, the current president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, who just won the election last year and he just took power on December the 1st. So he's got two mixed things. So one of them is this idea of the war's over, I'm going to create peace, we can have forgiveness, reconciliation. But it's hard to know what that really means. And his second thing is we need to have more of a unified state police. So like what I described before about you had local police fighting the federal police. So we've got to have, so he's got this idea now of a national guard, which is a kind of hybrid between military and police thing around. And that's basically these kind of two thrusts he's in now. He's only been in power a couple of months. January was still a bad month in terms of murders, like in terms of bodies. Last year was more than 33,000 dead last year, which is the size of Mexico, so equivalent of the United States having close to 100,000. Imagine what that would mean in the United States if you had that many people dying in a year.
A month?
No,
the whole year?
Yeah, in the year, 100,000. Yeah.
Now, when these people when they're being recruited by the cartels, when the police officers are being recruited, the big issue must be, there must be two issues, right? Safety, like if they don't join the cartel, they probably get murdered. And two, the amount of money the cartel would give them would be far more than the government would give them to be a legitimate police officer. Yeah,
sure. And that's like known famously plata o plomo, like silver or lead. You want to have the silver of the bribe, or the lead of the bullet. But even beyond that, for a long time, a lot of these people who join the police are like from the beginning there. I've got on video. Made a video back in 2010 in Sierra Juarez of a bunch of rappers just hanging around in the middle of all this. And one of their friends was saying, and they were talking, and these people were saying, some of them have been done for taking drugs over the border, they've been in gangs and stuff. And one of them was like, I want to be a policeman. And he was like, I want to be a policeman and make some money, basically through corruption. So it is like, that is the mentality of some of these people joining the police from early on. Another guy I opened the first book with is this guy who became a policeman when he was 18. He was basically a tough guy, played American football from Durango, became a policeman when he was 18. And in the police, learned to torture and learned to murder. He said, that's what I learned in the police. And at just 20, after 2 years, just left the police and went full-time into crime. It's like, so, you've got a situation where, it's not, it's worse even, it's beyond bad, the bad that a lot of people might imagine of corruption.
God, so all of this essentially is escalated from the time you came to Mexico. So when you came to Mexico, it's almost like you got in, if it was a story, you got in at almost the perfect time.
Yeah.
In a horrible way.
Yeah. You don't do these things on purpose. You don't think, if I'd look back 20 years ago, it's 18 years I've been in Mexico now. I had a whole, grown up in Mexico in that sense. I never look back and think that. And now, in terms of myself seeing this, I think for anybody, it's painful. How you process that level of death, that level of murder, that level of suffering. It's horrible stuff to see, and it's, you can still have a lot of people separated from that, families, people are bringing up children, and you want to separate kids from that. So often, like, middle class kids in Mexico are quite sheltered because families want to shelter them as much as they can from that violence, and just not let them see that side of things.
How much of that do you have to deal with in Mexico City?
So Mexico City, is about the same murder rate as Houston. So Mexico City is not super violent. Now, it's still not super safe, but it's not super violent. So Mexico City is kind of, and there are parts of Mexico which are fairly safe. Now, the state of Yucatan, where Merida is the same murder level as Belgium. So you've got oases within Mexico where you don't have this level of violence. So Mexico City is a great city. Mexico City is a great city to live in many ways, apart from the traffic and the pollution and various things. There's a bunch of things that are I love all of Mexico, and I love all of Latin America. I love even the bad places. I still love. I enjoy going to these places. I enjoy meeting people there. Hang out in these areas. There's a lot of good things about them still.
But dealing with all the horrific tragedies that you report about and experience, do you look for an escape route? I mean, are you looking to get the fuck out of Dodge?
Yeah, I mean, there's been different times where I've thought, I want to stop this now and cover other things.
Yeah,
as a journalist. And there's the other journalist doing that as well. There's a journalist called Jesus Esquivel, a great Mexican journalist I just saw him at the trial of El Chapo over in New York, who's been covering this for years. One of the really great Mexican correspondents who's covered the drug stuff. And he just said to me, "Oh, brother, I've got some stuff. Maybe I can give you. This is the this is the last thing I'm gonna do covering drugs now." And we'll see if that's true. I think a lot of the time you get caught still doing this stuff, especially when you've covered something, people want more, people are interested. There's relevance to this. I think some of the other struggles beyond like the danger and stuff is simply, with journalism's in a bad way, a lot of the media in a bad way, and just simply getting trying to I'm a freelance journalist. I love being a freelance journalist. I love the independence. I love being able to write books and travel and write magazine stories and make documentaries and do these things. But like just having the economic base for that, it's degenerated a lot in the time that I've been doing it.
Have you personally been targeted at all?
So there's a couple of situations I had. First I want to, I have to give some kind of respect and condolences to so many colleagues, Mexican colleagues, who have been murdered and have been murdered, threatened, had to leave the country and various things, and they've had it bad, including a friend, a good friend, a great colleague called Javier Valdez, who was shot dead in 2017, May 2017 in Culiacan, a guy who I'd known since 2008, great guy, got drunk with him in the cantina, a very generous guy, wrote 8 books, a charismatic, really lovely guy who was shot dead, and many other stories. So I kind of don't want to compare my own woes to a lot of them in many ways. But yeah, sure, there's been times. There's one time it was in a state called Michoacan, and this was 2014, and there was a thing that happened there when a lot of regular people rose up with guns against the cartels. They were known as autodefensas, or like self-defense squads. And they rose up to fight the cartels. And they a bunch of guys with guns. There was this kind of crazy situation where there was this almost like a trench warfare happened between cartels and these self-defense groups. And then what happened was a lot of regular gangsters started saying, "Oh, we're self-defense groups as well." We're just coming up saying, "Oh yeah, we're self-defense groups. Those guys are out on the street with guns. We're just going to go out with our guns." And so anyway, I drove down at the end of this. I've been covering this right through, and it had been fairly okay to do. The self-defense squads, the auto-defenses were pretty easy going to work with. But I drove down there to Michoacan, and I wanted to do some stuff on it. And I was meant to meet a friend and a journalist. She just backed out at the last minute. I just went down there anyway. And arrived there, and there was about 50 guys, arrived in this place near the city called Apatzingan. And there was about 50 guys who were supposedly a self-defense squad in a parking lot getting ready to go on a mission to try and take down this drug trafficker called La Tuta. And they were sitting there, there was a guy with signing them up for this kind of mission, and there was a bunch of guys, they had very heavy weaponry. They had AK-47s, they had AR-15s, they had grenade launchers on the top of their guns, and beneath their guns they had the grenades strapped to them, actually grenades on belts around them, ammunition belts around them. Crazy, you see old revolutionary stuff. Real crazy, desperado stuff. And then I was talking to them, and I realized quickly these were not self-defense guys. These were narco. These were gangsters. They came out with it right away. They were like, how long have you been in the self-defense, movement? Oh, a couple of days. And they were and then they had guns with like diamonds. They had Jefe.
What does Jefe stand for?
The boss. And I was getting on okay with them. I was kind of like, joking with these guys and taking some photographs of them. So they were posing for photographs. So they were sitting there with posing with their guns and stuff, and they said they have the word güero is like it's not really white boy, it's like blondie. It could mean like if you're white in Mexico, you often get called a güero. So like güero, how much do prostitutes cost in your country? That was like a question. I was like, I don't know, you'd have to go there and see. And they're like, güero, do you like taking meth? Do you like taking meth? I'm okay. And they were still like, kind of joking. And this guy came up among them and he said, to the other guys. Now, first there was a big guy, and he said he was carrying a big gun. This guy with a really massive head. And he said to me a bit aggressively, just don't take my photo. I was like, yeah, no problem, I won't take your photo. And then a guy came up and said to the other guys, saying, what are you doing? This is a DA guy here. This is a DA agent among you taking your photographs. What are you doing? And I was like, I'm not even American, I'm British. And he said, no, this is a DA guy. My brother was arrested in Texas, and the DA guy pretended to be a journalist. That's some bullshit story. And I said, look, I can show you my website. So they got the cell phone out and looked through the cell phone and found my website. And the guy calmed down a bit and he said, if I see you, I'm going to put a bullet in your head. I'm going to throw a grenade at you. He added. So I left, I kind of tried to talk a bit. I left. And and they went. And then I didn't publish the photographs. I've still got a bunch of photographs. And one of the guys sent me an email saying what happened to the photographs. My email's on my website. So I just ignored it. And I think a lot of them got killed in a big fight they had with the federal police afterwards. So that was one. And there's been a few more.
So it's a lot of touch and go when you're in these situations.
Yeah.
The federal police, do they have a plan to try to eradicate these mobs, or is it a lot of lip service? Like, is it really possible to eradicate these gangs, or is it just one of those things where they say they're going to do something, but they have to kind of protect themselves?
There's been different times. I mean, sometimes there's been the federal police have done well going after a particular guy, or sometimes with the Americans. There's been arrests of very many significant kingpins. The problem is as well is or one of the deeper questions is that when you take down some of these kingpins, you've always got other people who will fight over their same territory. Mm. So, for example, you take out Chapo Guzman, and then you get a fight among his sons and one of his lieutenants over the empire. Now, what's happened, and one of the reasons the violence has increased in Mexico, is because they've had this onslaught attacking cartels over the years. Then you end up with the lieutenants then taking over, and then their lieutenants taking over, and then their lieutenants taking over.
That's what happened in Chicago as well.
Right.
I spoke to a police officer in Chicago, and he said the violence escalated after there was some big gang arrests. Mm. And once they had gotten some leaders of some gangs, and other people tried to fill the void.
Yeah, exactly. So then you get some of the people who are in power now are very young, very violent people, and people who are not as smart, right, not as mature,
not calculated.
Yeah. And also you end up with they're fragmented territory. So you have people controlling, rather than having big cartels, some leader who controls half the country. You end up with these cartelitos, like these gangs controlling a part of a state. Now there's one state called Guerrero, which you've seen this really cartel fragmentation. And you've got maybe 12 different groups in this one state. And you get a place where they, one controls it up along a road, and then another group controls it passing a certain point. So there was some friends went up there. 7 journalists went up there and got held up on this road up there, 2017 as well. And they were in a car going up there, 2 vehicles, and about 200 guys blocked the road. And the leader of this group was a guy I believe called El Güero Palaya. Like, again, this name, Blondie Palaya. And he's like maybe 23 years old, like 200 guys there. They said some of the kids, I talked to one of the friends who was there, and they said he saw kids who was as young as like 10 years old among this mob of people. And they held them up. They took away one of the vehicles. They took away all their laptops, cameras, all of that equipment, stuck them in the car, said go.
Do you have to be careful when you're traveling that you don't have like an obviously expensive laptop or camera or something along those lines?
I think from the point of view of is, they can take it away. I mean,
Right.
It's happened a lot of cases recently of colleagues just being robbed. I mean, you get like an armed group and they'll take away they'll hold them down, take all their stuff. So you don't want to. So I've got I know various colleagues, photographers. And if you're a freelance photographer,
Right.
and you lose a good camera, then some of the TV people they have less expensive cameras than they used to. I remember a few years ago, a TV group interviewed some gang members up in Honduras, and they stole their camera. And it was at that time it was like an $80,000 camera, and the TV network, I don't want to say who it was, the TV network apparently was more pissed about losing the camera than it was about these guys, getting held down and having guns pointed to them.
What is the attitude in Mexico, especially amongst people who are studying the narco wars, with all this build that wall stuff, all this what's going on in America? There's this is very strange right versus left polarization over here about whether or not there should be a wall between the United States and Mexico.
Sure. The thing, Mexicans are obviously very anti-Trump. In Mexico, is Trump. Trump is very unpopular from the very beginning. When he said, they are rapists
And murderers, someone's doing the raping,
Yeah. I mean, he's kind of, if you look at surveys, the level's very low.
Does anybody like Trump in Mexico? Is there like there's always contrarians somewhere?
I mean, I've seen numbers like people say like 80% or something. I think he's terrible, so it means there must be a 20% somewhere who don't. I haven't met a Mexican who's been like pro-Trump. I never have. I met a Salvadoran who was pro-Trump one time. He had a guy who'd been deported, and he was like, "I know this guy Trump's going to turn out to be a great president." So I see that, but Mexico is very, very anti-Trump. In terms of the wall, I mean, there's in terms of what. In terms of the smugglers, I was talking to a smuggler in Nogales about this, and he was describing he was from Nogales, from a neighborhood called Buenos Aires, which is right on the border with the United States. It's Nogales, Sonora, Nogales, Arizona. Sorry, Nogales, Sonora, Nogales, Arizona. And he was from the neighborhood right on the border there. And he described that he first took people over the border with the United States back in the 1980s when he was at school. He was at high school. And the reason was that at that time it was just an old fence. And there was a hole in the fence. They used to go through into the United States and go back into Mexico, just an old wire fence. And the first time he took people through, people would arrive from southern Mexico and say, how do we get into the US? And he'd say, this way. And they give him a tip. He said the first time he got the equivalent of about 50 cents was what he made to take people into the United States, 50 cents. Nowadays, the cost of going into the US is $5,000. That's what you paid to go illegally into the United States, $5,000. So he was saying, wow, look at that increase. Every time that the US puts more security, it means it's more expensive. When it's more expensive, that means more money going to criminals, which means there's now an industry doing it. So now the cartels make a big percentage of that money of human smuggling into the US. But like in terms of the wall, I mean, when Trump first came in, he had the line that Mexico's going to pay for it. Yeah. And then there was this kind of line, right at the beginning, he threatened Mexican president saying, if you don't agree to pay for the wall, then why are you going to come and meet me? And then it was like, wow, he's really going to try and shake down Mexico for like billions of dollars. He's really going to try and do that. And that was kind of scary moment then, I think, from the point of view of Mexico. When he first got to power, it was like he's going to do that, and then he's going to deport 3 million, and he's going to kill NAFTA. actually those things haven't really come to pass. Actually, if you look over the last couple of years of Trump, it hasn't really hit Mexico very hard.
So the concern was that he was going to take money that should be allocated to other ways that's going to help Mexico, and he was going to try to take that and use it to build the wall?
I mean, no one really knew. When he first came in, he's like, Mexico's going to pay for this wall.
Right, the wall just got 10 foot higher. Remember that?
Yeah, and it was like, you know, how are you going to do that? You're going to start threatening Mexico militarily and say, give us money? I mean, it was kind of like is it a shakedown? You're going to do a shakedown? It was kind of a crazy diplomatic thing when he first got in. So that was kind of scary for a moment from the point of view of Mexico. But I think after you look at the last couple of years, he hasn't really hit Mexico with that. Now, if he wants to build the wall, now obviously there's the big fuss in terms of the spending here. But if he wants to build it or extend it, because there is walled in sections of the border already. If he wants to extend it, you know, it won't stop a lot of the hard drugs. I mean, if you look at heroin, cocaine, crystal meth, high-value drugs, they normally go through the ports of entry.
Right.
So
shipping.
Yeah, I mean they go
boats.
Or through the ports of entry, through like I mean you have through in cars.
Right.
Cars, trucks. I mean you go through, if you look at the Laredo. One of the reasons that was a big fight and the war started there in Mexico is because that's a very valuable territory. There's something like 8,000 trucks go over that border every day. Now, if you have 8,000 trucks, how many of those can you search in a day? And also the way they can hide this stuff in trucks, they can hide drugs in like a metal, they can put them in some kind of metal container, seal it up, solder it up, put a bunch of stuff so it doesn't smell. So somebody has to say, I'm going to open that with a blowtorch. I'm not just searching, I have to rip that vehicle apart to find the drugs.
They were putting them inside wheels.
Yeah. And that's like inside tires and stuff. That's like there's song. That's one of the older tricks from the 70s. There's a song. One of the first narco corridos, the drug ballads. It was called Contraband and Treason from the 1970s, and that was about hiding marijuana back in tires back then. But yeah, I mean now the trap cars now are like super sophisticated. They have some weird trap cars where you have to do like a bunch of stuff, like open the door, move some stuff to actually open and find the drugs. Oh,
there's like some trick sort of door that has to be activated. Yeah, I would imagine if there's a will, there's a way, and there's that much. I mean, I remember hearing that from, I mean, it's not a reliable source, but from The Sopranos. They were talking about only 20% of all the shipping containers that get brought into America get searched.
Yeah.
Well, that's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. So the hard drugs are going a lot of time through the ports of entry, and they have another classic trick they have is they allow some to get busted. So you allow one guy to get busted. They set somebody up, so they're taking some drugs through. They get busted. All the energy's on them, and then meanwhile more drugs are going through.
And is this the United States border that's catching this guy?
Yeah. Yep.
So they're not getting tested in Mexico as they cross over, right? It's only the United States border.
Yeah, sometimes they might catch them in Mexico. Sometimes, but the majority is going to be the United States.
Are the United States Border Patrol guys, are they ever caught being corrupt?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. There's been cases of U.S. Border Patrol and customs entry people who have been caught taking a bunch of money, taking bribes, allowing certain cars through.
Of course.
Certain vehicles through, so yeah.
How does one fix this? I mean, if you had a magic wand, you were going to wave it over Mexico and fix this problem. Like if somebody said, Ioan, you're a smart guy. You've been in the business for a long time. We're going to let you dictate how this takes place.
So I'd say, three things. So like drug policy reform. So we've got to talk about how we deal with this drug situation. So, I mean, like some of that is here, isn't it? And
yes.
you probably got a better idea than me about why do Americans take so many drugs? I mean, I come from a drug-taking community myself in the UK, I guess, so maybe it's not that different.
Well, I think there's a lot of answers to that. The biggest one is entirely that most people don't enjoy what they do, and they want an escape. I think that's probably the biggest one. There's some ridiculous number that was just who was discussing the number on the podcast of how many people actually was it was Johan Hari, wasn't it? Yeah. He was talking about the number of people that actually enjoy their job. 67% people in this country don't like what they do, or are just sleepwalking through their life. There's another significant percent that hate what they do, and then there's a few left over that love what they do. I mean, it's a very small number of people, maybe like myself or maybe like yourself, that actually enjoy what they do for a living and feel like they're following their passion. Most people are just working a job and they fucking hate it. And then when they get off work, they want to get fucked up. And a lot of these people, they have psychological issues. They're suffering from abuse, childhood abuse. They're trying to, there's been some significant statistics about childhood abuse and how many people from childhood abuse wind up using and abusing drugs and becoming addicted and even overdosing on drugs. And it's ridiculously high. It's about pain and suffering, and trying to remove that pain and suffering from your life. And, people that don't know how to make healthy choices and don't have friends that are making healthy choices and don't know what to do with their life. That's a big, big part of it. There's another part of it that's because it's illegal. There's something about things that are illegal that are intoxicating and enticing. When you look at the statistics in Holland in particular, where marijuana has been, you could buy it in coffee shops forever. Not that many people smoke marijuana in Holland. It's a lot of marijuana tourism, especially back in the day. Now that America has legal marijuana almost everywhere, not a lot of people are going to Holland specifically to get fucked up. But that was always the thing, man. When we were younger, it was always like, yeah, he's going to go to Holland and go get high. Like,
I went there. I used to go there when I was a teenager. I went over there for some of that when I on a boat and arrived in Amsterdam back in those days. Yeah, it made me smile what you're saying just there about enjoying the job, and it's true. When you said that, I do love what I do and enjoy what I do. So that's
you can tell.
That's one of the sides to that thing. But yeah. So in terms of the issue of drugs, we have to talk about this. How can we stop Americans stop spending that money, or allow that money, if it's going to be spent, not to be going to a black market and destabilizing these countries? But also a lot of issues in Mexico as well. Like, again, that social work. How do you change the reality?
Right.
And again, so, people who are abused and suffer taking drugs, but people who are abused and suffer in Latin America becoming assassins.
Yes.
Because one of the weird things on a moral level, on a level of morality, I knew a lot of kids growing up who sold drugs. And it wasn't really an amazing immoral thing to think about. I sell drugs. It was an easy step to take. I'm going to sell some weed, and then I'm going to sell some speed and sell some ecstasy, and then later on, heroin or whatever. But for somebody to commit a murder, that seems like a lot bigger deal. How do you how do you cross that line to becoming a murderer? How do they cross that line so easily?
Well, I think it goes back to that young boy that you were talking about that butchered that family. He was abandoned and angry and hurt, and just so much pain that he's suffering. That's often the case. They want other people to suffer. When you see people that are doing terrible things to people, they're almost always suffering. They're almost always wanting other people to feel what they feel. They're lashing out. That's that social work aspect that you're discussing is so critical, and it's something that we've discussed about this country. That how few people are putting. Very few politicians. Very few people that are running this country are putting efforts into trying to heal these communities that have suffered from just years and years of systemic racism, years and years of just embedded poverty that's almost impossible to escape, years and years of crime and drugs and just growing up in this community of despair. This is what we were talking about with Baltimore. This is what we're talking about with South Side of Chicago and various cities all over this country. It just, they don't get better, man. They stay fucked up. I had Michael Wood, who is a police officer from Baltimore, and he was discussing what it was like being in Baltimore as a police officer and then looking at some documents from the 1970s that detailed the crime in the very same areas that he was patrolling in, and the same crime in the same areas, and this sense of just overwhelming futility. Like there was nothing that he was going to be able to do that was going to put a dent in this, because this was, a lot of it was a product of, there's areas in Baltimore where there was law that you were not allowed to sell homes to black people in these certain areas. So they kept these people in these poor areas. And even though they had this desire to escape into the more affluent or safer communities, they weren't allowed to for a long time. I mean, there's so much of that in this country that the people that are in control, but everybody just wants to get elected. Everybody just wants to, and then once they get elected, then they're looking to get reelected. So they spend a gigantic percentage of their time campaigning. No, there's no universal effort on the part of all the citizens of the country to try to look at all these areas and say, hey, this is us. Just because you don't live in the south side of Chicago, those are human beings. Those are just like you and I. You could have been them. They could have been you. If they were you and you were them, wouldn't you hope that you would help? Wouldn't you hope that someone would come in and try to fix this area? Someone would try to pour money. We pour so much money into foreign countries. We pour so much money into subsidizing various industries that a lot of people disagree with. And I'm not an economist. I don't know what economic sense that any of that stuff makes, but I do know that money is allocated in a lot of different ways, and the idea is that it's going to be better for all of us. Well, it's not better for all of us to keep these communities as fucked up as they are right now. And there's no effort, nothing, very little done, no movement, no change, no gigantic step, no 10-year plan to eradicate gang violence, no 10-year plan to eradicate illegal drug sales and murder.
So there's great social work. There are some great social workers down there, and so there are some heroes in these places. There's somebody I talk to a lot based in Ciudad Juarez, a woman called Sandra, who grew up in this neighborhood. She was one of the first people who introduced me to young gang members in this area. She used to work in a factory there, got into social work. Now she's a psychologist. And yeah, she's somebody who really will do the work and reach people and will save lives. And some of the basic stuff you really get in the community and try and reach. Now you have to reach the kids when they're often 11, 12. And you can often see in these areas who are the kids who are going to get into this, who are going to be recruited by the cartels,
right?
Who are going to get to gangs, because there's certain profiles in these people. They haven't got their families. I was talking to some guys in also in Ciudad Juarez from the Barrio Azteca, which is one of the big gangs there. It started in the US actually among prisoners and spread into Mexico and became almost like a paramilitary group in Mexico, about how they recruit people. And this guy was saying, we will see, I can see from these young kids who's going to be able to kill and, who's going to be a real fighter and who's not. And if these people have got, parents who love them and so forth, these guys they're not going to work for me. Right. I need someone who's got hate, who's got anger in them, and I can do something with one of those. So it's kind of like the perverse opposite of this stuff, really. But so if people don't have that families, and this makes me, I guess, think a bit more sympathize, I guess, as well to the idea of how important family is, how important loving parents is. Whether you're together or separate, loving parents, having that, and but if you don't have that, you need social work and need people who can offer something and try and. Now, there was an interesting mayor of Medellin called Andres Guajardo, and he had these ideas of trying to change the reality of the city. And he said, I'm going to build the most. He was a mathematician, so I'm going to see this as a mathematical problem, this issue. And I'm going to build the most beautiful building in the ugliest part of the city, in the worst part of the city, to make and force people who want to. So we made a conservatory and put it in the poorest neighborhood, so that people who want to be in this conservatory have to travel to the poorest neighborhood and go there and try and change the reality. Because if you see around you a horrible neighborhood, a dirt street, no light, nothing working, what do you turn into? And if you see a nice environment around you, can you change people that way?
Wow, how did it work?
It worked for a while. It's hard to know exactly, because also there was a truce between some of the gangsters there as well for a while.
Was it related to the construction of the conservatory?
It might have. I don't know if the government was involved in the truce or not, but there was, for a time, the murder rate did drop quite dramatically in Medellin. And I don't know if people have carried on, but Medellin has improved. I mean, Medellin, Colombia was the worst, the most violent city in the world back in the 1990s, and it's not, and it's, people do like their city now in Medellin.
Wow. So it had some impact.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Then the social workers, I'm sure they have some impact on individual people, but I would imagine that the overwhelming volume of children that are being recruited, that it's very hard to put a real dent in it.
But I think in Ciudad Juarez it had an effect, because when that was the most violent city in the world, around 2010, 2011. And there was this turf war there between the Sinaloa cartel, which is Chapo Guzman, against local Juarez cartel. And there was 9,000 killed in that city over 4 years of that war. It was crazy. I was covering it then, and just driving around from scene to scene. It'd be like, massacre here, massacre there, just driving around, bang, bang, this thing's happening. And afterwards, there was a lot of social work put into the city. And Sandra described right then, she said there's a waterfall of aid money coming in. There was like USAID and stuff would start putting money into this, and other different groups, and the murder rate did really drop. So, and it hasn't gone back up to that level since. So I think it does have a real effect when it's put as a policy. It does have an effect on these things. But also, when you talked a little while ago about a magic wand on this, I mean, in making a police force that actually protects the community, or making a police force that has some kind of effect. I mean, I grew up in England, which is, a pretty safe place relatively, and I used to not like police and, hate that, be anti-police or whatever growing up. And now I appreciate, wow, you have police who actually protect the community in some way. And the same in the United States. I mean, in the United States, the police do protect people to a large extent compared to these countries. And, obviously there's issues here. There's an issue with racism and killing and violence and so forth. But still, I think a lot of the people who believe that a lot of people believe they have guns for self-defense. And I respect the right to have guns for self-defense. But really in America, you're generally safe because the police are pretty hard on clamping down. But how do you create a police force which really has the will to protect people? How do you have that? With the will and the passion and the commitment to help people in Mexico? That'd be a dream.
The people that have dealt with police officers that are corrupt have a very difficult time hearing what you're saying, right? Those people would be angry at what you're saying no, the police officers here are corrupt, they are bad, there is racism, there are real problems.
Yeah.
And there is, but I think there's also a real problem being a police officer, period. I think police officers have an insanely difficult job, and I think most of them are dealing with PTSD. I think there's a giant percentage of them, like all over the world, and in America too, that are constantly dealing with violence and the threat of violence and arresting criminals and being shot at and people lying to them. I just don't think, I think most people are very ill-equipped to handle something like that.
I mean, I agree there are definitely problems with the police, and there are problems. I mean, the police shootings are very real problems. Police killing innocent people here is very real. And you've always got to look for improvement. And there's families again suffering from that violence. And I don't want to belittle their story.
No, I know you're not. I know you're not. I just have to sort of clarify because I know so many people will be hearing this and going, "Yeah, Mexico's terrible. But the United States, there's a ton of videos." The real issue though is we're also dealing with the sheer number of interactions that police have with people. Yeah. The vast majority of them are fine.
Yeah, but I was going to say on the other thing, like say the crime of kidnapping. Kidnapping is a horrific antisocial crime. I mean, a horrific crime that destroys lives. There's one video which really made me sick, which was given to a family of a kid, like a 14-year-old kid, who was taken, and they sent this video to his family in Mexico, and they were beating this kid and saying to this kid, this is and the guy was saying to the camera, "This is your fault, you bitch," to the mum. "This is your fault. Look how your kid's getting beaten. Now you're going to give me the money." He's asking for like, was it $300,000? He's asking for the time. And those kind of crimes, now kidnapping doesn't happen in the United States on a very big level because you've got effective law enforcement. So I was at one conference and there was real nice guy, but there was people calling for the abolition of the police, saying there shouldn't be a police force, saying you really want to live like with no police, you really want to live with a dysfunctional police where they can just kidnap your kid and like send a video to you like that, and you've got no protection from that kind of thing.
Right.
I mean, there's definitely problems here, but also you've got to see the other side of having a completely dysfunctional police. force and what that means.
There's just such a staggering difference between the United States and Mexico in that regard, in regard to gang violence, drug violence, just overall murders, and the stories that we hear from over. It's so different. The fact that you could just draw a little line in the dirt, you cross that line, you're in hell, and then you cross this line, you're in Houston. I mean, that's fucking crazy.
Yeah. I mean, again, I get criticized sometimes from sometimes Mexican government sources or Mexican tourism sources. Like I'm covering this stuff, so I'm showing the worst, and it can give a distorted picture sometimes because when I tell a story of 49 decapitated bodies with their hands and feet cut off, people think, wow, so as soon as you say this stuff and some guy describing decapitating people, this kind of does, knock people out. So I don't want to say as well as that, it still is a great country.
Yeah.
I still, I love the United States. But I probably love Mexico more. And
what do you love more about Mexico besides the food?
I would say generally the atmosphere is good. I just feel people are nice generally. Despite all of this horrific violence.
Do you think it's because they don't have the same sort of ruthless ambition that people in the United States have?
I think there is a sense. We were talking before about why people are into drugs, and one thing that occurred to me is this kind of hyper-competitiveness of society. And people can feel like failures. Like if you feel like a failure, if you feel like, I guess, well, maybe social media's affected this as well because you see what people have and you expect you should have more.
Right.
And you feel you haven't lived up to it. I think in Mexico, people, if you're broke in the United States, you can often maybe feel like a personal failure. How come you're living in America and you're broke?
Right.
Whereas in Mexico, lots of people are broke. So you're like, it's like, you don't feel that same kind of personal failure with that.
When I'm there, one thing that always strikes me is how happy people seem. And that I think there's a certain stress level that a lot of Americans put themselves into where they're constantly pursuing material possessions, material wealth and success. And that oftentimes this leads to really exacerbated stress levels, and it doesn't make you happy. Like the whole idea of having things in our mind is someday if I buy this car, I'll be happy. If I live in this neighborhood, I'll be happy. And then so they work 12 hours a day to try to achieve that dream, and they're never happy. And they're always stressed out. And even though the vast majority of the United States, there's some insane number like 34, if you make more than $35,000 a year, you are in the top 1% of the world. Mm. So there's a giant percentage of this country that's in the top 1% of the world, yet the overall happiness level, at least from what I've read, is quite a bit below the people in Mexico.
Yeah. A lot of these things, how do you see your own happiness or measure your own happiness or sense of success or failure? So that's part of it. And the food is great. The food is amazing.
I'm a giant fan of Mexican food. Yeah. I love it. There's a place down here that I take the guys here that work here all the time. It is as Mexican as you get. No one speaks English there. They have Mexican soap operas playing on the television, and the food is just sensational. It's so good.
Yeah. So some of these things as well as that. But before you're talking about this border between Mexico and the US, it's a huge. Is that vast difference between countries and cultures, and the interaction. Another issue, I guess, is the issue of guns going south, and we talked about the drugs coming up. You've also got a lot of firearms.
Like that Fast and Furious deal.
Yeah.
The Eric Holder thing that went down years ago where they sold, it was some sort of a sting, and they sold guns. And those guns wound up being used to kill Americans and even American police officers.
Yeah. So the ATF are going after this, and there's, the number of guns. No one's really sure how many guns are going down, but there was one study that came to the conclusion that about over 200,000 guns every year go from the United States into Mexico.
Wow.
So
that's an insane number.
200,000 guns. And I interviewed a guy in prison in Ciudad Juarez for gun trafficking. And he would drive every weekend from Mexico up to the United States, buy like 10 to 15, mostly AR-15s, some other guns as well, and drive them down into into Mexico.
And it's pretty easy to get into Mexico.
So you drive them in. It's like it's a piece of piss. It's very easy. You basically most of the time you've got no control. Now he would actually hide them in fridges and in stoves, and would pay an import tax for the fridges and stoves. But he was buying them, and he said to him, I said, how did you buy the guns? He said, I would no idea at all. So what ID did you show to buy your guns? He said, oh, nothing at all. He said, no ID whatsoever. He said, no, nothing at all.
So did he buy them from gun shows?
So he'd buy them from gun shows, but then what he would do was he would use the private sale loophole, which they're trying to close now.
Yes.
So he would go in there, and then I went to a gun show in Mesquite, in the greater Dallas area, known as the gun show capital of America. And went to a gun show there and asked, people, can you sell me guns? I don't live here, can you sell me guns? And first they said, oh no, you need to be a Texas resident. Someone said, oh yeah, sure, I can sell you these guns. And it was, the reason they get out is they say it's a private sale.
Right.
However, some of them, and I know some of the pro-gun people get angry talking about this, but I saw this with my own eyes. They've got a whole bunch of boxed up AR-15 rifles, and they're selling them as being private sellers. Private sale. Now, so he was just simply buying these guns and taking them down. And I saw right in front of me as well somebody who said to the person, I can't buy, was looking for a different gun, and said, no, I can't buy it. I can't use ID to buy the gun. And the person, was still happy. Like, even the private sale loophole, if you, in theory, if you suspect the person is a criminal or would use them for criminal purposes, you shouldn't sell them a gun. But they don't care. And so one thing, you really want, do people really want people who, they could be MS-13, undocumented, they can still walk in and buy guns in some of these places. But then, so that's a big issue as well.
Those gun shows are pretty bizarre.
Yeah.
You're walking around with a bunch of people just itching to shoot somebody. It's like they're just hoping somebody breaks in their house. I know a guy who keeps a gun in his ankle at all times. He keeps one in his back. He's got a holster that he carries with him sometimes. He carries a knife as well. He's literally begging for someone to fuck with him.
I've got no problem with the people who like. I talked to a guy from the Alaska Machine Gun Association. he has about 200 guns in his basement. 200 guns.
Wow.
And I don't have a problem with people with doing that, but then there's still like, how do you stop the guns going to criminals? The same, right. The criminals in Baltimore.
Right.
I also interviewed in Baltimore a gun trafficker who was taking guns into the city of Baltimore.
The gun show loophole is very strange. It's very strange that that's allowed. And this is coming from someone, me personally, who owns guns. And I believe in the Second Amendment. And I don't think that the way to stop people from doing illegal activities is to make those activities illegal for people who don't do anything illegal. I think the real issue is the psychology behind people that are willing to shoot people in the first place, and to deal with the overall mentality of these human beings and try to figure out what's wrong with our society. Cure it at a base level, at a human level. That's what's really wrong. It's not the inanimate object of a gun that's the problem. It's the human beings that are willing to use these guns to commit horrific acts. That's what I think. But when you have something like drug cartels, which exist, or gangs, which exist, and then you have this thing called a gun show, and then you have this gun show loophole. Well, boy, you got a fucking giant hole in your dam. You got water pouring right through right there. Like, how do you not fix that up? If you are a person who believes in the Second Amendment and you believe in legal and responsible gun use, you should be angry at that, because that represents a gigantic problem, and that also represents a threat to legal gun ownership. Because if this keeps happening and people keep getting outraged and more mass shootings happen with illegally acquired guns, after a while, it's going to come to some sort of a real conflict with people. Yeah,
I'm actually doing a new book about gun trafficking. So I'm really interested to hear about these issues and what the actual room for compromise is, or what someone like yourself who believes in the Second Amendment, how much room for compromise do you think there is on these issues? Like closing the gun show loophole. The other thing, like for example, the issue of 50 cals.
Yeah.
Now 50 cals in Mexico, the cartels use 50 cals. They use them to set up ambushes. They'll use them to hit military vehicles, police vehicles. So they'll sit on the side of a mountain and then have 50 cals and go bang, bang, and like go right through.
They're like baseball-sized bullets. It's crazy.
Now imagine if you're
not quite that big, but they're big-ass bullets.
No, yeah, and I understand. Obviously, a lot of these Mexican police and military are corrupt as well. But if you are an honest one or whatever, you're going in a car and you start getting hit by one of those going into your vehicle, then they open up on you.
Yeah.
So is there any room there, do you think, for like clamping down on 50 cals? I've never heard that discussion that much.
I have a friend who has one. Anthony Cumia, he's got a 50 caliber. It's ridiculous. I mean, the idea that you're using that for self-defense, unless you're going to war with Russia or, fighting against some cartel gang that's invading your city, that's a military weapon. I mean, it's the same argument, I think, for having a fighter jet with Hellfire missiles. Do I think you should be able to own a Cessna and fly a little plane around? Sure. Okay. Do I think you should be able to own a jet? Well, I mean, there are a lot of rich folks with private jets. Okay. Do I think you should be able to own a fighter jet that goes the speed of sound? I mean, it's just a faster jet, right? Yeah, okay. Do you think you should be able to own a fighter jet with 50 caliber guns strapped to it? Oh, well, what the fuck is that? Are you starting a war? Like, what are you doing? There's like these levels that things get to, That's the argument against automatic weapons. Like, you can't use automatic. Like, certain states have regulations in terms of what you can. In California, you can't even have a silencer. I don't know why, because it's very bad to have that loud bang of a gun. It's terrible for your ears. And if you're a hunter or someone who likes to shoot target practice or something, that's a terrible thing for your ears. And there's a suppressor that they could put on the end of the barrel and it'll mitigate that. But for whatever reason, I think mostly because of films and public perception, people think that those silencers are only used by assassins or something like that. You're using to kill people.
So they convert the semi-automatics from the States in Mexico. They convert them to fully automatics.
Yes.
So they
do that here too. And then of course about bump stocks.
Yeah.
Which makes it much more free with the trigger, much easier to fire rapidly rather.
So how do you feel about the issue? One of the issues is of having a database, like the ATF or they're not allowed to have a searchable database on guns in the United States. So they have paper files and stuff they go through still. They can't have like a digital database on guns.
That seems ridiculous, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you think. I mean, I guess the gun lobby see the idea of a gun registry as being a step to taking away their guns because, like, once you start registering, then you can go then afterwards and say, well, we know where the guns are, or whatever. But how do you feel? Think there's flexibility on that issue of like the gun, of like having searchable databases? I mean, like with a car, like you have a license plate. And if there's a hit and run, you just type it in and you know whose car it is within seconds. With gun tracing, you can't, you find a gun at a crime scene, whatever, you can't just put a button and you go like, bang, that's whose it is. They have to go through they have to go through a whole formal trace and go through this kind of search. So you think there's flexibility on that issue as well, or how do you feel about that yourself?
Well, I myself feel there should be a traceable database. I mean, it's just like a car, and I'm glad you brought up that analogy because when you get a car, you have to know how to drive a car. You have to, in order to have a license to drive a car, you have to take a test. You have to take a written test, and you have to take a physical driving test with an instructor. They have to see, and think about how many more people drive cars than own guns. So it's possible to do this with guns, yet it's not done. When I bought my first gun, they're like, here you go. I was like, what? Like, that's it? Like, yeah, you're not a criminal. Look, we did a check on you. You're not a criminal. Here's a gun. I bought a pistol. I bought a .38 revolver. That was my first gun. And I went to the gun range and practiced with the gun. And I read about how to do it. And I talked to an instructor about safety and put goggles on and ear muffs and, make sure you're protected and how to properly hold the gun while you shoot it and all these different things. But it's stunning to me that you don't have to do that. I mean, you can own 150 guns and know how to operate 0 of them, and they're all yours. You don't even have to prove you know what the fucking safety is. You don't have to prove you know anything. That's crazy.
I mean, I admit it's fun to shoot guns. I mean, and since I've been doing research for this new book, I've been shooting a few guns in places. I went over to Serbia, and I arrived in Serbia on a hangover. I'd seen my friends in the UK and got drunk with them. And I arrived in a hangover, and I'd met the contact there and said I wanted to go to a gun club. And he took me into a nuclear bunker. and fired an AK-47. Just came off the plane.
Wow.
So, yeah, and it was like, wow, they had a crazy. They said, whatever you want to fire, they had a crazy amount of guns there. So I can see it's fun to fire these things. Do you think they actually are good in self-defense? I mean, do you actually think? I mean, I don't. You know, in Mexico, I don't have guns. I wouldn't. When I travel in the field, I won't go with security. Security is going to be more of a hindrance because
they attract attention.
Yeah, attract attention. And they've got to go basically with my hands up and say, look, this is me. This is what I'm doing. Most of the situations there, you've got to have a lot of people with heavy guns. You're not going to outgun these guys.
Yes.
In Central America, it was a bit different. In Honduras, I was with guys with guns there, not out of choice of choosing security, because the journalist himself was carrying a gun and had friends carrying guns. And he was carrying a mini Uzi. He was driving with this journalist friend of mine, Orlin Castro, his name is, great journalist. He was driving around and he had a mini Uzi on his lap as he was driving around to crime scenes and running around doing stuff. But do you think guns are actually effective for self-defense? I mean, do you have guns for self-defense and believe in that, or simply just enjoy the sport of shooting guns?
Well, I hunt, and one of the things I have used, although I archery hunt now, most of the hunts I go on when I go to these places to bow hunt specifically. But I have rifles for hunting. I have handguns for self-defense, and it depends entirely on the situation. That's like saying, do you think cars are effective to get you where you want to go? Well, they are effective if you drive carefully and you use the blinkers and look when you change lanes, and make sure you observe the speed limit and all the different laws and are aware and don't crash into anybody. But if you're an asshole, no, they're not effective. You're going to wind up dying in a car accident. You're going to flip your car over on the side of the road. If you're in a terrible situation, it is better to have a gun than to not have a gun if you know how to use it. If someone's breaking into your house, there is countless stories of people protecting their families from bad guys when they have guns. These are real stories. They do exist. There are people that I've talked to. You can find them. There's countless stories. There's also countless stories of people leaving their guns unlocked, and a child gets a hold of it and kills himself accidentally. There's stories of children accidentally killing their mothers. There's all those stories too. So can a gun be effective in self-defense? For sure. That's why the military use them. That's why police officers use them. That's why people train and they go to the range and they take tactical courses to learn how to use a gun for self-defense. Absolutely, a gun can be used for self-defense. It's the best thing for the best tool for self-defense, other than obviously living in a good neighborhood, having a security alarm, all these different steps. Dogs are good, especially a dog that's a trained dog. But yeah, guns absolutely can protect you. If you're in a situation, someone breaks in your house and you shoot that person dead, you're safer than that person killing you. That has happened. But this is a gross generalization that's entirely dependent upon the situation that you find yourself in. But if you're not protected by if you don't understand how to use it, if you're not trained, if you don't have training to keep your shit together when things go south, because when you're in a situation and your life is in danger, if you've never been in a high pressure situation before, how do you know you can keep it together and even hit something you're aiming at? People have wild trigger panic, and they have a really hard time dealing with life or death situations if they haven't served in the military or been in some very, very high stress situations where you have to learn how to control yourself under extreme pressure conditions. There's a lot of factors there. But I would say the same thing is like, You would also say that with martial arts. Like, can you defend yourself if you know martial arts? Well, depends on what you know. I mean, some martial arts are fucking horseshit. There's a lot of people out there practicing nonsense, and if someone who actually knew how to fight just punched them in the face, they would be doomed. And then there's other people out there that are experts that would be very calm if someone tried to fight them, and they would know what to do and what not to do. And if the person wasn't armed, they would be able to easily dispatch them. It really is dependent upon the situation, how much effort you've put into it, how much thought you've put into it. But there's a lot of people out there that if you broke into their house, you're making a huge mistake, because they're trained and prepared and ready because they don't want to be a victim. And it doesn't mean they're bad people. And I think we have a problem in this country where we look at things, they're very binary. They're 1 or 0. They're good or bad. Guns are bad. Guns are always bad. I don't want a gun. Bad guys take your gun sometimes. Sure, sometimes. Sometimes you kill the bad guy and you protect your family, though, too. That's real, too.
Yeah, no, I have respect for people having guns for self-defense. When we're talking about shooting, I've been around a few shootouts in Latin America and over in Haiti. And one thing about that from a journalist's point of view and being around it, and I've been seeing a lot of violence as well, like people fighting, even going back to England, people having physical fights or with knives and that kind of thing. So one of the differences I think with guns is, it's funny, you can't see bullets. It's like a small thing, but like you can't see the thing that's hurting you. When you see a guy with a knife,
right,
it's like the guy's scary. You can imagine that knife sticking into you. But the gun is like you're seeing, the object. You can't see really the bullet going in. So one of the times actually I was in Haiti, and I went in to cover the earthquake in 2010, which was real sad. Like crazy amount of dead there, and we were covering the looting afterwards, and the police came and started firing right into where people were looting, and I was with a cameraman. And the police were firing bang, bang. And during the same situation, not right in that scene there, but in another scene, they shot and killed somebody, the police just firing at the looters. And all the looters started running. When the police started firing, they were firing, again, how high were they firing? But they were firing, bang, firing these bullets down. And the cameraman I was with was just sat there and he was like filming this. And I think this is one of the problems that why a lot of cameramen get shot in these places. You start feeling like you're watching it on TV.
Oh, wow.
Because you feel like, you're sitting there listening, wow, this is amazing. Look at what I'm watching.
Yeah.
And you're seeing this, and it's like not saying that run, we got to go, like they're firing. It's like we got to go.
He wants to get the shot. Yeah,
we got to go. Now there's another sad thing of a guy filming, American journalist called Bradley Roland Will, rest in peace, who was killed in Mexico back in 2006. And he was filming a shooting in the state of Oaxaca. And he filmed these guys shooting, and he fell and was hit, and it carried on filming. So he literally filmed his own death. I mean, you can literally see there. Sad. I was working for a news agency when that day when he was killed in.
Yeah, there's a lot of courageous camera people, and they get locked into that job, and it becomes normalized, almost like you were saying, the people that live in these war-torn areas, it becomes a normal way of life to them. And although there are a lot of murders, if you're there on a daily basis, it seems like almost like a regular life. A lot of these cameramen, they're courageous people. You see these guys who go over to war zones and film what's going on in Afghanistan, and I've met some of these guys. It's a crazy way of life to just accept the fact that you're an observer that might be a victim, and you're capturing all this so people like me can get some semblance of a perception to what's going on in that part of the world.
I went over to the Philippines, southern Philippines, and saw the fight against the Islamic State there in end of 2017. And it was interesting seeing that compared to the violence I cover normally in Mexico. So that was ISIS. They took over the city called Marawi. And it was an area, they called it was interesting, it was more self-contained. They had an area called the Main Battle Area, the MBA, I think, Main Battle Area. So in that area was ISIS and the Philippine army just going at it all the time, just like constant bang, 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 and planes going over and bombing. But actually, even when you're outside that main area, even if you're, we were just outside it, and even if you're like 600 meters or 600 meters from it, but you're not in the fight, and the fighting is over there. Whereas in something like Mexico, South America, a lot of time this fighting is kind of happening everywhere. There's no real control over where the main battle area is. But they didn't really let any journalists inside, like deep into the main battle area. They didn't really let any journalists in. We were sitting outside and hearing just constant ricochet of gunfire. But sometimes bullets would come out of the area. So there was an Australian guy, and I think he bent over to pick up some cookies. and a bullet hit him in the neck. I saw the X-ray actually of the bullet embedded in the side of his neck, and actually it was taken out. And he was
so it must have been at the end of its terminal velocity.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it must have been a far, far, far shot.
Yeah.
Or it went through something else before it hit him.
Yeah. So he maybe didn't go in too fast.
That's crazy.
That's why I didn't. Yeah, exactly. So it was kind of a being.
He's okay.
Yeah, I think he was okay. He was okay with it. Yeah.
Boy, that guy's lucky.
Yeah,
gets shot in the neck and you're okay.
Yeah. So, but yeah, in terms of some of the people who've really been in, they had one of the guys, one of the police special force guys, had a camera on his helmet, and he showed me that footage, and he was right inside there, going there like really really close buildings, fighting with these Islamic ISIS people. And it was the same techniques. I talked to the general, and he had a big chart showing how the techniques of guerrilla warfare had evolved from like Fallujah, Aleppo, Mosul, and how this kind of weird new form of guerrilla warfare they have, of like fighting house to house. So basically it's suicidal kind of guerrilla war. They rise up and they'll be like, super close, fighting really close. So and then when they're bombed, they'd hide in like, basements and stuff. And they drill holes in the wall so they can fire through. And the footage he showed me the footage he had from being like right inside, close up, like running literally in the room, bang, taking these people out. And it was like, wow, this is just crazy. I was trying to persuade the guy to let me put that footage out there. It looked like a kind of crazy video game, kind of Call of Warfare. Sorry, Call of Warfare, is that what it's called? Call of Duty. Call of Duty, yeah. Call of Duty, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, Mexico right now is almost like a war. I mean, you can call it a drug war, but because it's not like an army versus army war. We don't think about it that way, but in terms of the amount of violence that goes on over there and the amount of casualties, it rivals anything that's going on in the world right now.
Yeah, so I've been talking a lot about this over the years and with some like experts. There's a good writer called Robert Bunker, who's an external researcher for the Pentagon, and he investigates this stuff. There's a guy called John Sullivan from here in California, who was a police officer who also did a bunch of research and got like a doctorate in studying a lot of this stuff as well. Talk to them about their ideas about what this means. What is the how can you define this in terms of warfare? How does it fit in? And they directed me to one book by an Israeli historian called The Transformation of War. And this was written back in the early 1990s, and he basically predicted then you're going to see a transformation in war, an armed conflict around the world. And, we have like nuclear weapons, but they're useless in these situations. Nuclear weapons, you can't use a nuclear weapon to solve the problem in Mexico. You can't use a nuclear weapon to deal with the Islamic State. These are internal insurgencies in countries. So if you look at Mexico, it's a kind of weird hybrid. So between crime and war. So I use the word crime wars in some of these places, say like Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, where you have. There are some situations in Mexico where there was a group called the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Some of their guys shot down a military helicopter using an RPG-7.
Wow.
They killed 8 soldiers and a federal policeman in that helicopter. There was one shootout which involved 2,000 federal police and 500 sicarios, like 500 cartel hitmen, had this crazy battle in Michoacan. Wow. So sometimes you actually starts to look more like a kind of regular conflict, but generally it's all, way more kind of hybrid. So it's kind of weird mix. And so I was trying to get my head around this for a long time. For some years I was trying to think, is this a civil war?
Right.
Should we look at this? And then it became, this. And then it was, Robert Bunker when I talked to him one time, and he said, this doesn't fit into these theories. It's not quite war. It's more than crime. It's a weird hybrid in between. So kind of crime war, and that's the way you got to understand these things. But a lot of the conflicts around the world today, these are spreading. You look at Somalia, you look at Libya, you look at a lot of these places, a kind of weird mix, instability.
Yeah.
And then this is what a lot of refugees are fleeing from. And I was down in Tijuana At Christmas, I followed the migrant caravan that came through Mexico of Central Americans, which caused a big storm here that Trump kind of hit on before the election.
What was that like? Was that overblown?
I think it was a big deal.
Was it a publicity event? Like, is that why they were doing it and making it such a big deal and everybody's walking towards the border? Like,
it was a bit more than that. I think these caravans had started a few years ago. And they started off in Mexico for security. There was an issue back a few years ago where the cartels would kidnap migrants en masse. They would just get loads of migrants. Now you think these people are poor, how can they make money from them? But they'd get them, put them in camps, and they know they have family in the United States. So they say, okay, we've got 50 people in a camp. We want $5,000 off each one of you, off your family. Like, give us a number. We're going to call your family. Okay, send us the money down. And then sometimes they'd agree on, okay, 2,000. But so it sounds like, you're making money out of poor people.
Right.
But you do it en masse. You do it 10,000 people, and you get a couple of $1,000s each. That's like, $20,000, $200 million. So they started doing caravans for strength to avoid these mass kidnappings. What was different about the latest caravan? They actually became a caravan crossing borders. They used to be going through parts of Mexico together. Then they started crossing borders. Now the caravan began in October, around October 12th. And there was a call for them to meet. And my friend Orlean, again, the journalist down in Honduras, he was down there filming with his TV crew, putting it on TV. Oh, they're down here, they're going on this caravan, and suddenly it went boom. And like loads of people saw it on TV. And they're like, I'm leaving. Now the desperation was so heavy. Now Honduras is in a real meltdown kind of stage. Honduras is bad. Venezuela's worse. But Honduras might be like number 2 for real meltdown cases in Latin America right now. So people were like, I was talking to some of these people, they would say, like, I saw it on TV and that's it, I'm going. Just decided right away, I'm going to get my bag and I'm going to go. So they arrived when they went through Guatemala, they became big, like 7,000 people. Arrived at the border with Mexico. And, first of all, they tried to, there was a push and shove on the border and tear gas was fired. And they went down and crossed the river, some of them walking across with a rope, some of them going across on tires. It was a kind of crazy scene, this scene down, they were squatted half the bridge and then they came down. So it was kind of a big deal. I know the idea of calling them an invading army and so forth was obviously overblown, but I think it was significant scenes, quite historic scenes that were happening down there.
And what was the overall goal? To make it through to the United States?
Yeah, different people had different ideas. It was kind of one of these weird things, like it was go to the United States. Now, some people had no idea where they were going, had no real plan. Some people had very clear cases of being like, I'm a refugee, understanding a bit about refugee legislation and like fleeing very specific cases where they've been targeted by gangs working with corrupt police who want to kill them, who have like attacked them. And they've run and like, I want to seek refuge in the United States or in Mexico. Someone was seeking refuge in Mexico, which is not the safest place to seek refuge. Yeah. There's been cases of people with one cameraman I know who fled Honduras and then was killed in Mexico.
Has there ever been any discussion of the United States military intervening and trying to do something about the cartels?
So there's been like a U.S., some U.S. forces, like U.S. Marshals, sometimes, Mexico is very proud of its constitution and very proud of its sovereignty and doesn't want U.S. force acting in Mexico. And I think the kind of idea really of U.S. military is pretty out there. It's pretty, it wouldn't help. It would be bogged down into more problems. And there'd be no appetite in Mexico for that. But there have been some cases of U.S. doing some kind of activity in Mexico. Like, for example, when they went after Chapo Guzman, when they got him and there's a big shootout, they got him the first time actually without shots fired. And then he went to prison and escaped.
That one escape he's escaped more than once, right?
Yeah, escaped twice, yeah.
Did he get helicoptered out once?
No. There have been prisoners who have been helicoptered out, which is crazy.
He had the one tunnel escape with the electric bike, right? Which is crazy.
Yeah.
When he went to the bathroom and just stepped behind the door and he's gone. Yeah. That was insane.
It was really weird when I went to New York right now, seeing him in the court in New York, like seeing him in the flesh after all these years covering this stuff. And I saw him, and it was like, I've been to his village before. I talked to his mother. I'd stayed the night with his cousin in his village.
Wow.
Up in the mountains. Seen
what's it like up there?
It's quite rugged mountains. Sierra Madre. It's like you go in a car up and on like we went in a 4x4 serious off road up and down, and there's people wandering around there fully armed. Like saw guys with like ski mask. One guy like camouflage gear, camo gear, ski mask, AK-47, just like on like quad bikes, just driving around the area.
Wow!
And we went up there with a colleague and a photographer, story for Time magazine, and we went up there and drove into the village. And I bought a bottle of whiskey, thinking to kind of offer to the family member to say, here's a bottle of whiskey and when we arrived there, and he said we could stay at his house, and I bought out a bottle of whiskey. I said, and he said, we don't drink in this house. We're Christians.
Wow.
We don't drink. And it's this nice guy, and he was like evangelical Christian.
Wow.
Cousin. And we'd sit there talking, and he'd be like quoting the Bible.
Whoa.
And come and stuff. And it's like,
does he not understand?
Yeah. And there's a church, it's an evangelical church right there, which is supposedly built by Chapo, which his mother goes to, right in front of her house. And we sat through a 3-hour evangelical service, sitting there with, Chapo's mum there and all his family members were sitting there. And the cousin even said, we've got some friends here. Because he was basically, he said, like, you stay with me, you're my responsibility. If something happens, I'm going to have to pay for this.
Right.
So we're like, we're going to behave ourselves and in the village. And he said during the church, we want to also have somebody from England here and somebody from the US and come out in this church ceremony. So really, really bizarre scenes up there. And there was
so bizarre. But did you talk to them about the contradiction of being an evangelical Christian, being involved in essentially a mass murder and drug running operation?
So the cousin is supposedly, he was like a cattle rancher now. I don't know exactly, obviously he calls, he I don't know how much he might have been involved in the past, but he says he's a farmer there, and the mother, Chapo's mother, who's 88, was 88 then, now is like 89, 90 now. She talks about her son with kind of pride. I didn't push too hard on there was a bunch of gunmen around and stuff. I didn't like push too hard and But yeah, this is their way of life. So seeing him in the court was kind of bizarre. Seeing him right there, and in New York as well, in Brooklyn, right there in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And they brought in all of these crazy characters as cooperating witnesses. They brought in 14 cooperating witnesses, and a bunch of other gangsters.
How do they protect those people?
Yeah, heavily protected. I think it was ethically very questionable why they brought a lot of those people in. They brought in one guy whose nickname is Chupeta, who confessed himself to as many as 150 killings, and maybe he did a lot more. And he makes a deal to cooperate against El Chapo. So you get into a kind of weird intrigue there about what the government was doing with this whole case.
Yeah, there's a history of that in this country with prosecuting the mob, with John Gotti and Sammy the Bull Gravano, who was an admitted murderer, and talked about the murders that he committed, and still they allowed him to get free.
Yeah, one of his John Gotti's lawyer was one of the lawyers for El Chapo.
Of course.
Yeah, and then they had another. So they got some of these lawyers there. It was a crazy kind of show. Yeah. It was weird. It was like New York and the show they were putting on there.
Yeah.
I felt a kind of disconnect with the things I've been seeing over the last few years, and it didn't really.
Why was it in New York?
they indicted him in a bunch of places, and I think they chose New York for the reason they wanted more of a show.
Wow.
I think they brought more than 50 witnesses. 3 months of trial.
What was his defense?
So they originally tried a bit of a defense of. They wanted to go a bit of a defense of how there's a kind of government conspiracy of like showing things like Fast and Furious that you mentioned, like saying, "Oh, how come the government's trafficking guns to the cartels?" And one of the witnesses against him had before used this weird defense called public authority, saying he had permission from the United States government to traffic drugs. So basically saying there's a kind of conspiracy involving the Mexican government's totally corrupt and working with cartels. The US government is corrupt and working with cartels and having very suspicious agencies. And El Chapo is a kind of a fool guy that they're putting this blame on. Now that didn't really, the US prosecutors shut that down, and the judge, they just said, you can't talk about this stuff. You can't say that. So like when Fast and Furious came up, they said, no, you can't talk about it.
You can't talk about it.
You couldn't talk about it in the court.
Well, that's ethically ambiguous, right?
Yeah,
because
exactly.
like that's a real thing that happened.
Yeah. So we can't talk about that. And then the defense tried a bit, they had audios of El Chapo, and they said, how do you know it's him? And is he really the main guy in the Sinaloa cartel? Now there is, as well, very possibly he's not the top guy in the Sinaloa cartel. There might well be another guy called Miles Zambada, who's really the number one, and he might be more of an emblematic figure. But for some reason, El Chapo became the most famous in the world.
And so this other guy, is he still free?
Yeah, he's still free.
What is his name again?
Mayo Zambada.
And where's he at?
Somewhere in the mountains in Mexico.
They're always in the mountains?
Often. I mean, one of these weird things you think, like, if you're a drug lord and you've got all of the money, you've got millions, billions, they say, let's say hundreds of millions. I think they exaggerate how much money some of these guys have individually. But then you could go anywhere in the world. You think you could go somewhere out. But these guys tend to be in their places. They're people, like, some of these people are people who are very uneducated. I mean, El Chapo, as a kid, he was carrying sacks full of oranges to sell, almost no education, and they start handling billions of dollars. They're dealing with $1 billion international business, and they've got the capacity to understand and deal with that. But at the same time, they're still really hyper-local in some ways. They're still like people who, they understand their world, they understand it from their environment, to control and become masters of their environment, to become kind of powerful in that place, lords in that place. But they couldn't. The idea of them going to, like, sitting in Italy in a cafe and kind of running it from there, they don't. It's kind of beyond them.
They would have to be there near the business, because otherwise someone would just take it over, right?
Yeah. So,
you probably have to run that thing with an iron fist.
Yeah, I mean, you could think though, or maybe like, yeah, I guess so.
Maybe you get your Christian cousin; he won't rip you off.
Yeah, but how much money do you need to make?
Right. When can you get out?
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, again, with corruption, I mean, there's the issue of, like, a lot of police in Mexico are poor, so that's why they take deals. But there's an ex-governor called Thomas Yaddington, who I met a few years ago when he was governor of Tamaulipas state. And again, he was not only taking money from drug traffickers. After he left being governor, he got into drug trafficking himself. And it's like, you think, well, once you've made a couple of million,
right?
Do you need to make another 10 million? But then again, I mean, the same with I don't understand
with
that.
Business.
With businesses. Yeah. What's that incentive? Why do they think they always want to make more money?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we were talking about that recently with Jeff Bezos when we found out he has $150 billion. Like, when do you just say, we're good? We're good?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I think it's a game more than it is anything else. Like, they might as well be playing Parcheesi or Monopoly or whatever. They're trying to win. They're trying to constantly win, and also you have an obligation because you're a CEO of this company. So you're running this enormous business that's earning money for all these other people as well. It's all very complicated, though. That has to do with a lot of psychological factors where people can't put things into perspective and they get caught up in the race.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. I mean, drug traffickers are thinking that same thing.
Yeah.
Some of the guys, when they're making, I mean, also that, like people have explained to me involved in this world, they make a lot of money, but they spend a lot of money. Which is why these numbers are wrong. Like with Chapo, they said, He's worth $14 billion. That's what the US government said in that case. He's worth $14 billion. But then people explained to me, $14 billion is when you take the value of drugs you're saying he trafficked, and you're adding that up and saying it's $14 billion worth. But really, all the time, you're paying back suppliers, you're paying people off, you're owing money, and and
you're buying hippos and jets and gold-covered Rolls Royces.
Yeah. Though some of that, I think, some of that might have been exaggerated with him. He had a lot of kind of more like middle-class houses.
Oh, yeah.
I went to one of the last hideout he was caught in. It was more like a middle-class.
It's a normal house.
Kind of house, but he'd have a lot of those.
What the fuck happened with Sean Penn?
Yeah.
Why was Sean Penn up there talking to him? That was so strange.
Yeah.
That photograph of Sean Penn shaking hands with him. And then Conor McGregor wore that same T-shirt and he took that same pose on when he was going to fight Eddie Alvarez, I believe it was. Yeah. What was that about? Like, why was Sean Penn visiting him?
Yeah, bizarre moment. I mean, you have an actor who's played gangsters.
There he is, right there.
Yeah, there it is.
So strange.
An actor who's played gangsters with a gangster who they're having, movies made about him.
And there was a woman that Sean Penn knew that hooked this all up, right?
Kate Castillo.
She's a famous Mexican actress. Is that the deal?
Yeah. So the whole story started there. She is, yeah.
Look at them all palling around. Hey, here's me with a murderer. Hi. I used to be married to Madonna.
So the story started. So Kate Castillo, who you see there, she was an actress in a TV series about drug traffickers, which have now become a huge deal in Latin America. They're called like telenovelas, means like soap operas kind of thing, TV series. And a whole bunch of them made about drug traffickers, which are really popular. And she was in one called La Reina del Sur, the Queen of the South. And in that, she played this drug trafficker. And afterwards, in some kind of weird moment afterwards, I think she was like really into her role and stuff. She came out with this message she wrote saying, Mexico is in such tragic situation in Mexico. Why don't they come, drug traffickers come and like traffic with love. I trust you more than I do the government. These are kind of sentiments that some people have, but it was kind of a strange thing, kind of a bit of an out there thing for a TV star to say. And then El Chapo apparently became kind of enamored with her, seeing her on TV, and they started this kind of communication. Now, Sean Penn then got involved in this and was like, I'm going to go there as well, and we can talk about the idea. The pretense of the meeting was as well talking about making a movie or TV series of his story. And El Chapo giving the rights to Kate Castillo, and Sean Penn was kind of involved in this somehow. Now, Sean Penn, there's a bit of discussion like now that Sean Penn and Kate Castillo fell out over this. They have different versions of what happened there. But, Sean Penn decided to go and write this story for Rolling Stone about the whole experience. Yeah. So they went then, and this meeting was arranged, and they went up to the mountains, and when that photo was taken, now at that point, he didn't actually give an interview to Sean Penn, but they had a dinner and they had a meeting up in the mountains. And then left, and then they were meant to, afterwards, there was then a big attempt to hit Chapo, but he escaped. So that's when some people say that the Mexican government had followed them and used their trace to try and get to El Chapo. But he did escape. He almost got caught close to there quite soon afterwards, but escaped.
It makes sense. I mean, how else would Sean Penn be able to slide through? He's a famous actor. I bet he doesn't even speak Spanish.
Yeah, no, I don't think he does. I mean, I don't know if he was followed. I'm not saying that he was in any way deliberately leading them there, but it's something that I think about all the time. I think about, okay, if I'm going to meet criminals, am I being followed?
Right.
And am I going to lead? What's my connection with law enforcement? What's your connection with criminals? It's a very difficult thing that I've been balancing and thinking about for a lot of years. So, anyway, the Chapo escaped. and then said he couldn't meet up again for the interview because it was too hot for him. So they made this video interview where he was sent some questions and he videoed himself answering the questions, which is kind of interesting. It was the first kind of statement he made, and he said, I know various things. I've been doing this since I was 15. He didn't really give much away. And then he was caught, and when he was caught, they were like, we've got to move the story. So then the story came out like bang after he was caught in early 2016.
So it had to have some sort of an impact in them catching him. Must have.
I mean, it's possible.
It only makes sense.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, Chapo, I think, was pretty... he'd already been caught before. So he was caught in 2014, was in prison, escaped in 2015 through that tunnel, and then was caught again in 2016. So, yeah, I mean, maybe it had an impact. I don't want to...
But they were looking for him.
Yeah, they were looking for him, and he seemed to have lost a lot of his protection. He before, going back a few years, he had enormous protection. And those mountains. I mean, in the village, you see there's a house above, like there's kind of a main clearing where his mother's compound is. It's pretty basic still, that village. Then up from there, you see a house on a hill, and apparently that's where El Chapo, for a long time, used to go and just stay in that house. When he was on the run in the past. So he had so much protection, and anytime the military will come close up the mountain, you've got hundreds of people on radio saying the military are coming up. Get clear.
Man, what a crazy world you study. Really, it's amazing. I really appreciate you coming here and talking to me about this. And this book is El Narco. Do you have more books that are available?
Yeah, sure. So my first book's El Narco. My second book is Gangster Warlords, which also has stuff on the MS-13, on the gangs in Brazil, the gangs in Jamaica, as well as Mexico. And I'm working on my third book now.
And the third book is about?
About gun trafficking.
Well, listen, man, I really appreciate your time, and you've lived a very, very fascinating life. Stay safe out there, man.
Great to be here.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate it, man.
Thanks,
you.
Man.
Thank you very much. Wow.